Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Turkey is stepping forward as the self-appointed adult in the room of the Black Sea, warning that the war must not creep any closer to its coastline, while quietly positioning itself as the future security guarantor once the shooting stops. After renewed attacks on commercial vessels, Ankara is sending a message to Moscow and Kiev. Escalation is unacceptable. Instability will not be tolerated, and the Black Sea will not be allowed to turn into a free fire zone. Now, at the same time, Turkey is laying the groundwork for what comes next. This is a move about securing relevance in European defense, reinforcing its strategic autonomy, and reminding everyone that when it comes to the Black Sea, nothing serious happens without Turkey's say-so. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
The Russian shadow fleet of oil tankers is starting to run into some issues. This one here fell victim to Ukrainian attack in the Black Sea and has been left floating off Bulgaria's coast. The strikes on the oil tanker, not the first in recent days, mark a shift in how the war in Ukraine has been affecting the Black Sea region. For the most part, the war had avoided the sea entirely, mostly due to Ukraine's limited naval presence. Yet in response to years-long attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure by Russia, Kiev has begun to strike back against Russia's oil tankers, a move aimed to cripple the secret Russian oil export empire. Turkey, which sees itself as the guardian of peace in the Black Sea, is not happy about this development.
We say all the parties, Russia and Ukraine, to keep the energy infrastructures out of this war, because this is very much linked to people's daily lives. But we also know that the energy infrastructure was the main target in some days in Ukraine.
To make matters more complicated for Russia, Turkish tanker managing company Beşiktaş Shipping said it would halt all operations involving Russia. This came right after one of its ships was struck by a series of explosions off the coast of Senegal. Russian oil export is one of the pillars of its economic empire. The shadow fleet has been the primary method through which Russia has been avoiding energy sanctions. If these options are no longer safe, then the Russian economy might find itself in a far worse situation than the Kremlin may have anticipated.
And now we're zoning in on the east-splaining portion of our show. Historically, and even today, Turkey sees itself as the custodian of the Black Sea. Well, this tradition dates back hundreds of years, all the way to the conquest of Constantinople. It is also grounded in a far more recent policy, namely the Montreux Doctrine.
The Bosporus and the Dardanelles Straits are the only way to enter the Black Sea from the Mediterranean. The 1936 Montreux Doctrine governs ship passages through the straits. In peacetime, merchant and trade vessels can freely pass, while warships are limited in size. In wartime, if Turkey is not a belligerent, foreign warships may transit the straits freely under normal peacetime conditions, with the exception that Turkey may bar warships of belligerent powers unless they are returning to their Black Sea home ports. In the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Ankara activated the war mode of the convention and essentially blocked access for Russian warships, cutting the Russian Black Sea fleet off from any reinforcements from the Mediterranean. Simultaneously, the convention also bars entry to non-Black Sea fleets such as NATO ships from outside the region. So despite Turkey being a NATO member, this means that foreign aid through the Black Sea is also very limited. The war in Ukraine shows that the convention remains a key diplomacy-forging policy, which gives Turkey unique leverage over the Black Sea. It is policy that is beneficial to NATO, as it has affected the Russian side far more than it has Ukraine.
And now, as always, it's time to take a look at the issue in greater detail. There is this slimy concept floating around called the Shadow Fleet, a collection of tankers carrying many names flagged under whichever country happens to blink first, all designed to smuggle Russian oil under the radar of Western sanctions. Think of it as Russia playing intercontinental hide-and-seek with giant metal lunchboxes full of petrodollars. So, what happens when you start blowing up the lunchboxes? First, the insurance companies spit out their coffee. Suddenly, shipping through the Black Sea costs 2.5 to 3 times more because, oh hey, global war risk. Then, firms like the Turkish Beşiktaş Shipping go like, peace out Russia, we're done here. Turkey, northern Black Sea, the entire region, it's all being dragged into a maritime game of musical chairs. Only the music now is explosions, and the chairs are tankers that might or might not have been carrying real oil, fake oil, or they might have been a maritime disaster waiting to happen due to the risk of oil spills. Now, meanwhile, Russia screams piracy. Ukraine claims it's self-defense, and international insurers update their rates like they're ordering pizza. One Black Sea special, hold the oil, extra risk. Because the punchline is, if you think the war ended in the trenches, it doesn't always happen like that. The war is now in the pipelines, on the high seas, in the small print of insurance policies, and in the cold statements of shipping companies. The map is fluid, the battlefield changes, and every tanker that sails through the Black Sea or tries to skirt around in Africa might just be the next headline. So yeah, demand for secure maritime corridors just got a weird new meaning. It's no longer about ports and harbors only, but about whether your oil tanker survives long enough to beep its GPS. Welcome, I guess, to the new front. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Adam Michalski, Research Fellow, Department for Turkey, Caucasus and Central Asia, the Center for Eastern Studies. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Pleasure to be here.
So let's imagine for a moment that Turkey doesn't have the control that it has over the Black Sea. How would the war have actually looked like if that was the case?
Well, I mean, definitely the war would have favored Russia in that case. Let's remember that Russia has not only a Black Sea fleet, but also other fleets in the other seas that it operates in. Right before the war broke out in Ukraine, Russia was already sending additional warships to the Black Sea, and it just so happened that it wasn't thinking that Turkey would so quickly block the Bosphorus Strait. This was one of the reasons why, for example, Putin described the war in Ukraine as a special operation. One of the reasons was not to trigger the Montreux Convention, which regulates the passage of vessels during peace and wartime through the Bosphorus Straits. But that plan didn't technically work out because Turkey blocked the straits after 4 days. And what happened is, I think, approximately 10, maybe even 15 Russian warships were not able to pass to the Black Sea. And so in the first couple of weeks, this was a very strategic move that really allowed Ukraine, that really gave Ukraine a fighting chance to at least dissuade further Russian attacks, in part because Russia was a little bit underpowered to what it wanted to have on the Black Sea. So in terms of that, yes, Turkey has been playing a fundamental role thanks to the fact that it does control the straits of the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus.
So effectively, before Ukraine was, of course, able to develop its excellent countermeasures in the form of naval drones and other means by which it effectively pushed the Russians away from its shores, if Russia had been able to amass a large naval force, it could have actually launched a major attack on Odessa, for example. And regrettably, it might have been successful then, before Ukraine was able to devise all those strategies that actually gave it this disproportionate power on the Black Sea that it has today, right? So Turkey was effectively a country that allowed Ukraine this sort of this moment to become reorganized in this regard.
Yes, absolutely. So I support what you said. We have to look at it from the perspective of the first couple of weeks and then what happened later on. In the first couple of weeks, I'd say that Ukraine wasn't as well prepared on how to fight Russia off. And there was a real threat that with a large Russian navy operating in the Black Sea, that Ukraine would have been cut off from the Black Sea altogether, including Odessa. That didn't happen. In fact, what happened throughout the months that came after was the direct opposite. Ukraine had countermeasures to Russian presence at the Black Sea, as, for example, the famous sinking of the Moskva warship became kind of a symbol of the fact that naval warfare on the Black Sea against Ukraine wasn't really feasible because it only took a small drone in order to sink a huge vessel, and as a result be a huge kind of image hit when it came to Russia. To Russia. So as a result, Moscow decided to kind of scale back its operations from the seas focus on this operation on the land. And I'd say that, yes, I mean, today, paradoxically, the war is no longer taking place on the Black Sea. This has nothing to do, I think, with Turkey right now blocking the Montreux, the straits thanks to the Montreux Convention. It has to do with the fact that the Black Sea itself is too small of a sea to operate from a good distance, where Russia would not be endangered by Ukrainian drones, whether it's the ones that fly or the ones that are on the sea. And as a result, Moscow has decided to kind of really scale back that operation from the seaside. And as a result, all the attacks that we're seeing on Odessa, the majority of them are happening from the land bases that Russia operates, not necessarily from the sea. And so I think that Ukraine has, in the months after the war, shown that it can effectively push Russia outside of, effectively Ukraine can push the war towards a land battle and essentially eliminate the threat of a naval battle, making it too costly for Russia to engage further in this type of warfare.
So now we have another factor in the current conflict. Specifically, we have the shadow fleet. We have Russia attempting to funnel its oil revenues through the Black Sea shipping lanes. And now Ukraine, of course, isn't really sitting idle. It is trying to counter that by engaging not only with port facilities, but also directly with the ships. And that is an issue, right? Because how has Turkey been reacting so far to this? Because Turkey was trying to serve as a stabilizing force. It didn't want any sort of major spillover of military activities to the Black Sea itself. But I was seeing elements of that activities actually touching upon those tanker ships, and in particular situations where they might have some sort of links or affiliations to Turkish companies. Do you think this is a bit of a risk for Ukraine to do that, given the position that Turkey has?
I mean, it's definitely a very risky strategy for Ukraine to engage in such a way when it comes to its relations with Turkey. Straits, I think it was only a couple days after the two ships that got hit at the Turkish exclusive economic zone in the Black Sea, that the Turkish side summoned both the Russian, I think, charge d'affaires and the Ukrainian ambassador for formal talks on this issue. But I can guarantee you that informal talks were happening even prior to that. And that has to do with the fact that, well, for Turkey, this type of an escalation in its own economic zones is something that, well, threatens the kind of free trade or kind of the ease of trade that has been taking place with whether it is thanks to the Russian shadow fleet or the Turkish fleet, which is operating in the Black Sea, with each side technically making use of the fact that the Black Sea has not been so far a place of confrontation. And so what we see right now with Ukraine is that it slowly is ramping up the costs of, trading with Russia by targeting, first and foremost, of course, Russian vessels. But as we've seen also in the past, Turkish vessels like the one that got hit in Senegal, which was transporting apparently Russian oil. And so for Ankara, this increases the costs of the war. It increases furthermore the cost of trade. Because obviously companies which operate these routes are no longer going to be willing so much to risk their vessels for the sake of a profit with Russia. And so we've seen a couple of companies move out or declaring openly that they're not going to be trading with Russia and they're going to be doing something else. But yeah, at the same time, we also have to think about, basic things like insurance. If Turkish vessels or any vessels, for that sake, are being targeted in the Black Sea because apparently they are either part of the Russian shadow fleet or just doing business with Russia, then insurance companies are not going to be willing to, provide insurances for these big ships which are transporting oil or whatever products. And that, as a result, makes it technically illegal to cross, for example, the Bosphorus Strait, because you need to be insured in order to do that. So for Turkey, it creates an avalanche of new problems that it was not expecting or that it really wanted not to deal with in in this war, and for a long time it didn't have to. But now we're seeing that, of course, Ukraine is ramping it up. And to answer your question, what does that mean in terms of Turkey-Ukraine relations? Well, it definitely is, I think, a tricky situation of how Ankara is going to play it off. Turkey still wants to be the mediator of this conflict, and right now Ukraine is kind of ramping the conflict up from Ankara's perspective. So Turkey has been so far very quiet, but I'm sure it is becoming a huge problem for them right now, also how to deal with the Ukrainian pressure on the Russian vessels.
So what are the alternatives for Ukraine? If Ukraine wanted to try and not anger Turkey further, and yet if it still wanted to target the Russian shadow fleet, because, the shadow fleet is not neutral, right? We have reports that in the Baltic Sea, for example, there are suspicious crew members traveling on those ships and not really fulfilling any sort of specific functions. They are just there to represent the Russian companies, the Russian state. Sometimes these ships are also used for espionage. They could be used as launch pads for drones, conducting a variety of operations. And in the Baltic, naturally, that brings additional risks in the form of hybrid warfare and so on. Do you think that Ukraine will now try to shift its attention to ships situated or traveling further away from the Black Sea? That's one thing. And also specifically avoiding any ships that might have a connection to companies based in Turkey?
Well, definitely, I would see an expansion of, I think, Ukrainian activities when it comes to the Russian shadow fleet, particularly abroad, where the cost of, blowing up a tanker or something like that is much lower politically, much less visible, and as a result, much less of a threat to, for example, other nations which are supporting Ukraine or to some extent engaged in this warfare. But at the same time, I would say that, from the Turkish perspective, this type of engagement still does not eliminate some of the primary threats that whatever happens with this type of further escalation is still not completely eliminating the threat of the Turkish ships and ports being targeted. I think this is one of the biggest issues, is that while Ukraine can shift perhaps in the future some of its operations outside of the Black Sea and target, other tankers and other international lines, it still kind of remains a big question of what exactly does that mean still for the Turkish fleet of ships and vessels which are trading with Russia, because this is kind of, the black hole in this whole thing. You have the Russian shadow fleet, but at the same time you have the Turkish fleet, which of course isn't necessarily breaking any sanctions, in part because Turkey didn't join the sanctions regime of the West, but at the same time it's one of the reasons why Russia has kind of an a opportunity to kind of shift its goods abroad. And it's also thanks to the fact that, there are countries which are trading with Russia, and Turkey is one of them. So how will Ukraine play this off in order not to further antagonize Ankara? I think that this is going to be a very tricky thing, because you can target the Russian shadow fleet, which I think is something that a lot of countries can agree on, and this isn't that much of a disputed thing. But then at the same time, what happens with all these other vessels, which it's not always that easy, or if they are, part of the Turkish fleet, especially, when you're not necessarily on board of these ships, it's very hard sometimes to figure out who is actually who and who's operating what on that ship. So I think that while Ukraine might be avoiding in the future any type of further escalation with Turkey by targeting Turkish vessels, that doesn't mean that with a kind of increased activity of targeting Russian shadow fleets, that Turkish vessels will also be to some extent targeted, whether it is intentionally or I would say most probably unintentionally. But this is something that Turkey has to deal with. And I think that this is the biggest problem for Turkish shipping companies is, well, what if Ukraine makes another mistake or perhaps unintentionally targets a ship in our port?
Adam Michalski was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Pleasure to be here.
And now, moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is continuing his quest to shore up various partnerships and alliances in Asia. India is the most recent of his adventures, and it seems that despite US pressure, his visit has resulted in some progress for the Russian side.
Ever since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, India has become one of Russia's most important trading partners, especially when it comes to oil. Cordial scenes like these from Vladimir Putin's visit to the country have become a fairly common sight, but there is more to this relationship than meets the eye. Despite US sanctions on Russian oil during the visit, the Russian president pledged a continuous steady supply of oil to India. Just last year, Russia supplied nearly 36% of India's total crude, and although India is scaling back the import due to US pressure, it seems that this partnership will not end so easily. The two countries also pledged cooperation in other sectors. Russia's space agency Roscosmos is interested in selling Russian rocket engines to India, and the Kremlin-aligned RT news station has launched a service in India that has been sanctioned by Putin himself.
Russia is creating a war crime tribunal for the Ukrainian soldiers that it has captured. These trials are meant to investigate alleged crimes committed by Ukrainian troops in Russia's Kursk region.
Russia's propaganda is in full swing as it is developing a new narrative. As the International Criminal Court has cracked down on Russian officials over war crimes, Moscow has decided to make a tribunal of its own. This new entity is meant to resemble the Nuremberg trials, which saw the sentencing of many Nazi German officials over their war crimes and crimes against humanity during the Second World War. Russian officials have admitted that they have not yet chosen the city in which these trials would be held, and have even suggested that they would take place after the war's conclusion. And as Russian officials are eager to start sentencing captured Ukrainian soldiers, they are also promoting new conscription initiatives. In the latest one, the Kremlin has been encouraging potential conscripts to bring a friend along with them when they go to a recruitment center. In exchange, the original conscript is to receive an additional paycheck.
Several countries have been scrambling in the wake of Ukrainian strikes on the Caspian Pipeline Consortium facilities. One of the affected parties is Kazakhstan, which is currently looking into alternative oil export routes.
According to Reuters, Kazakhstan is looking to start shipping 30% more oil westward through the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline this month compared to November. This shift in export volumes can be explained by the recent Ukrainian attacks on the Caspian Pipeline Consortium facilities, or the CPC. The CPC route handles the bulk of Kazakhstan's oil exports and recently suffered heavy damage. This in turn has led to interferences with the country's regular oil tanker shipments. While Kazakhstan has called on Ukraine to cease strikes against the CPC facilities, Kiev says that these are legitimate military targets and that Ukraine is carrying out these strikes in self-defense.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.